Here's a short video on how to use the George gauge. With the George gauge, you typically will get two forks. There are a 2mm fork and a 5mm fork. The way you differentiate one from the other is the color. The gray is a 2, the white is a 5, but they also have markings on the fork that have the number 2 and have the number 5. What this basically means is when you put the fork in the assembly, from this notch to this bottom notch, it's 2mm, and if you put the 5mm in, you've got a 5mm space between the notch and the lower aspect. The first thing you want to do is loosen up the bottom screw. By loosening up the bottom screw, you got a little bit of freedom of movement when it comes to this lower component. The idea here is to just passively attach this to the lower teeth. So with the patient slightly opened, you want to kind of just get the George gauge portion engaged or fixed into where the lower centrals are and tighten up the lower aspect so you have a decent purchase point. Typically, vertical will be decided upon the type of appliance you may want to use. So a nylon base, such as a Narval or Panthera, needs very little vertical, whereas any other resin base needs significant vertical, more typically in the posterior aspect with a minimum of at least 4mm of clearance. So one way to judge that is to have the patient bite down the back teeth, bite down, and kind of get a sense, do they have a significant overbite or are they pretty shallow? If they're shallow, you're probably going to need more vertical, and if they have a deep bite, you're probably going to need less vertical from an inter-incisal perspective. So in this case, I'm going to go ahead and use the 5mm fork. By attaching the 5mm fork into the upper component, once again loosening the up top screw so this has freedom to float, you want to go ahead and set the device back into the mouth and have them close into the notch. Go ahead and close into that. Now, once they close into the notch, the key thing is to look at the numerical pad that's on the George gauge itself. Go ahead and slide your jaw forward. As they slide the jaw forward, you'll see that the top fork actually goes in a positive direction, where there's a positive or negative indicator on the George gauge itself, and slide your jaw backwards all the way back. And then you have the fork going into the negative aspect. What you want to do is take a note of the numbering that the fork approaches. So in this case, when she retrudes, she's at -5, and go and slide forward for me, all the way forward. And she's about +5 when she protrudes her jaw. Open it for me. So she has a range from -5 to +5, which is 10mm. The next part is to determine where to start your case. Some practitioners like to use 50% of protrusion, some may use 60, some may use 70. In this instance, I will use 60%. So if she's 10mm, from the -5, 60% of 10mm is 6mm. I would go from the -5 to 0, which is the 5mm, and then add the 1 to give us 6mm of protrusion from the most negative aspect of the jaw movement. Once I determine that position, I will lock the fork in. So now that you have it built in where you're actually at 60% of protrusion, go back in and reattempt and retry this in. Go and bite down into that. And what you're going to get a sense of is the amount of vertical that you've achieved, as well as the amount of clearance you have in the most posterior, in this case, if we were using a resin type device. Now you've got choices. Some like to use wax, some like to use putty, some like to use blue mousse. The lab prefers it that you have enough indentations on the most posterior. The better choice is to consider putty. So if we were to use putty, mix it up and basically go ahead and place it on the fork. And as I mentioned, do not be sparing. The more indentation you have, the better the accuracy, the better the mounting will be from a lab perspective. Once you add the putty in, return that back into the patient's mouth. And go ahead and slowly bite down for me all the way into it. Slide back a tad, bite down hard into it. And what you're looking for is a good indentation, so from a lab's perspective, they have something that's decent to mount with.